So tonight's video is going to focus a little bit on kind of the history of evolution, how the theory came about, a little bit of vocabulary, nothing too heavy duty, just kind of working our way into evolution. So obviously when we talk about evolution, we got to talk about Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and lived until 1882. He spent about 5 years on a ship called the Beagle as it was traveling around the world. His job actually was to be a friend to the captain, because at the time, social rankings, it was not okay for the captain to socialize and befriend the regular men that worked on the ship. So as someone of the wealthier class, basically his role, like I said, was to befriend the captain. And so while he was on the ship and they were sailing all over, he collected lots and lots of samples, took lots and lots of notes on the natural life that they were seeing. They spent the majority of their time in South America and the surrounding islands. You know, you're going to always hear the Galapagos Islands associated with Charles Darwin, where he studied his finches. And he published his book, his theory, called On the Origin of Species in 1859. He was actually not the very first one to publish something like this. It took him a long time to come up with, basically to gather the courage, because obviously at the time evolution was not widely accepted. And during that time, someone named Alfred Wallace had published similar theories. He was a British person that was working in India that had published similar theories on evolution. But when it was gone, when people went back and looked through Darwin's notes and research, he could prove that he had been studying this and come up with this idea. He just didn't publish it first. So two of the main things that Darwin's On the Origin of Species accomplished is that his research established that all species of life descended over time from a common ancestor. Okay, so he was one of the first to propose this theory of common ancestry. It also proposed the scientific theory that the branching pattern of evolution, that you may see drawn in the phylogenetic tree pattern, that branching pattern of evolution was due to natural selection. And that natural selection is going to be based upon struggle and competition. And natural selection is based upon the struggle for existence. And that this struggle for existence is going to have a similar effect as would selective breeding and artificial selection. There's something that's also called artificial selection. We see it all the time in agriculture. When we selectively breed for plants that are larger or produce more fruit. And so that natural selection would have some of that same outcome as if selective breeding was occurring. By the 1870s, many people had accepted evolution as an appropriate theory. But it took a lot longer for natural selection to be accepted as the basic mechanism of evolution. Darwin proposed it in his book in 1859. It took over 10 years for society as a whole to even accept evolution, and it took almost 50 years, 70 years for them to accept natural selection. Natural selection was not accepted as the mechanism of evolution until the 1930s and 1950s, when studies were done during that time to help prove that. Some of the observations Darwin made that led him to propose his theory was that populations change over time. And he cited the fossil record as evidence of these showing that these populations were changing and everything wasn't always the same. Darwin also noted that more offspring are always produced than the preceding generation. So there are more offspring. As each generation occurs, more and more offspring are being produced, which would make sense as the population is growing. You have the opportunity to produce more offspring. Darwin also observed that if left unchecked, populations will grow at a geometric rate rather than an arithmetic rate. Okay? Basically stating that if there's nothing to control the population, then it will grow with that J curve. It'll grow at an exponential rate, okay, rather than a linear rate like that. It will grow exponentially. And he used the example of elephants. Now his math is off a little bit in his example, and we'll look a little bit about what he did wrong. But his example with elephants was that they were considered the slowest breeding animals. They took the longest time. And they have, his thought was that if they had unrestricted reproduction, then in 750 years, there would be 19 million elephants from the original 2. So the pair of elephants, after 750 years, would have produced 19 million elephants. The problem was he did not take into account death rates, and he did not assume a 50-50 split of male and female offspring. So Darwin proposed that these elephants would very quickly exceed the carrying capacity, and they would could eventually cover the earth. And you can see in the graph up here on the right that it is a geometric pattern here of population growth, as opposed to that linear arithmetic pattern. So his math was a little bit off, but his thought process was correct, in the sense that these populations will grow if they don't have any limiting factors, and they will grow exponentially. But like I said, he didn't factor into account death rate, which, as you guys know from ecology, you need to factor that into population growth. And he did not assume that if there were 4 elephants born, 2 were females and 2 were males. He did not do an even split of males and females. Some other things that Darwin observed was that there is variation within a given species, and we know that. If you think back to your freshman year with theory of natural selection, that was the number one thing. There had to be variation in the species. If there's no variation in the species, then there's nobody that's any better than anybody else. Think about it with us. If you look around our classroom, when we're in our classroom working, nobody in there looks the same. So there is variation within any given species. And so based on that, he noted that any kind of variation may affect the organism's ability to reproduce. And remember, if it can't reproduce, then it can't contribute to the gene pool. And that's huge, right? Its contribution to the gene pool. That's the whole point of evolution, is to be able to pass your genes on to the next generation and ensure that your DNA stays in the population. So if you have a variation that helps you reproduce, good for you. But if you have variation that hinders your ability to reproduce, then that's no good. So not saying whether it's a good or bad thing, just saying that the variation can have an effect on its ability. He also noted, again, like I said, that species are going to change over time, and in particular, they're going to change over time related to the traits of their genetic code. So not just that they are going to change, but this change is going to be related to the traits that are inherited or the genetic code being altered, not just using the fossil record as proof, but proving why. He also determined that some traits are beneficial. Some inherited traits are beneficial, and whether it's beneficial or not is going to depend upon the environment. And since the environment is constantly changing, there may be a time where a trait is beneficial and there may be a time where it is not. But that is going to depend upon the environment that it lives in. So these are all observations that Darwin made on his way to coming up with this theory of evolution. So let's look at the difference between an adaptation versus an organism's fitness. So an adaptation is going to be a genetically controlled trait. It's going to be favored by natural selection. It's going to give the organism a reproductive advantage. So these adaptations, they help ensure that this reproductive advantage is passed on, and it stays in the gene pool, stays in the population. But this is a genetically controlled trait, this adaptation. Okay? And remember, again, it is genetically controlled. So the organism has to be born with the adaptation. The organism cannot decide that it needs to fit into its environment better and adapt to it. Whereas an organism's fitness is its contribution of genes to the gene pool, not how fit it is in the sense that how healthy it is or how long it's going to live, but what was it able to contribute to the gene pool. So these, for example, these hairs here in the middle, if you look at them, that you can see adaptations, genetically controlled traits that would be favorable due to natural selection. For example, the antelope hare there lives in a much warmer climate, has these large ears, long limbs that help give off heat. It has the brown coloring to help blend in, whereas the snowshoe hare here is going to have smaller ears to retain heat, smaller body, white fur that's thicker and heavier. These are all adaptations that are favored by natural selection, so this organism will survive and reproduce. Their fitness would be the genes they're able to contribute to the gene pool, not the fact that the antelope hare can cool off quickly. The environment, however, is constantly changing. It is not static. And so what may have been a benefit or may have been a good adaptation at one point is now no longer. So traits or adaptations that were once favorable can become unfavorable. And I'm hoping, you guys remember this example with the peppered moth of an instance of that, of the environment changing and that shifting the population. So remember, there were two types of peppered moths. You can clearly see the peppered kind there and the dark kind there. And so these, there's our variation within the population. There are two different colorings of these moths. And originally, the trees that they lived in were covered in lichens. Okay? And so those lichens gave that tree that kind of grayish appearance there. But remember, after the Industrial Revolution, the amount of sulfuric acid and soot that were released by the factories killed the sulfuric acid that was released, killed the lichens, and soot was also being deposited on the tree. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was beneficial to be the peppered colored moth because it blended in. So that was a good adaptation. 2% of the moths were dark colored, 98% were peppered, because that was a better adaptation. It would make them more fit because they're probably contributing more genes to the gene pool. After the Industrial Revolution, however, it was more beneficial to be the dark colored moth. So that shifted as to which adaptation was more beneficial. So again, back to that variation, if there had been no variation in the population, then these moths could have potentially been wiped out. The predators may have been able to see them too easily, and they were eventually wiped out. Currently, actually, the population is shifting back towards the peppered kind, because even though it's after the Industrial Revolution, with the regulations that have been placed on pollution, they are starting to see the lichen and such grow back on the trees, and so the peppered moth is actually becoming a better color. So evolution can be defined as a change in the inherited characteristics of populations over generations. So keep in mind that you notice it said a population, okay, so over the population, not the individual, over generations, and the inherited characteristics. Okay, what evolution does, it's going to give, we're going to give rise to variety here, diversity. We're going to get diversity both at the macroscopic level, so the large, full-scale species level that I can see, as well as the cellular level, okay, because of these different inherited traits and the diversity of the DNA. And we have two basic kinds of evolution, microevolution and macroevolution. So let's get through those two different kinds of evolution and we'll be all set. So microevolution is defined as the change in the gene frequency within a population. So this is within a population. We're looking at the actual genes themselves and how often they occur. This is when we use Hardy-Weinberg and those kinds of things. Okay, so this kind of evolution, this kind of change can be observed over a short period of time. We can see this happen from one generation to the next generation. So this is looking at such a small scale here of our gene frequency in the population, I can calculate that every single generation. And so I can look at microevolution. Examples of these might be things like pesticide resistance. Okay, I can see from generation to generation that shift in the population very quickly of the resistance to pesticide, of that gene being maintained in the population and becoming more and more frequent as they breed. So let's look at some of the vocabulary that would be associated with that. As we're talking about the change in gene frequency, hopefully you guys remember what a gene is. Okay? Remember, our genes are our sections or sequences of DNA that code for one particular protein or polypeptide. So this is that small piece of DNA on the big, giant, long strand that's going to specify one particular protein, amino acid sequence, polypeptide. That's our gene. And so our chromosomes are made up of lots and lots of genes. And our allele, remember that term? Our allele is the form of the gene. Remember, there can be more than one form of gene. It's very easy to think about that in terms of like traits that have color, like eye color. Okay, there are more than one allele. There's more than one form of the eye color gene. There's one for green, one for blue, one for brown. So that's what the allele is. It's basically the varieties of the different of one particular gene. There are 4 basic causes of microevolution. The first one may be that natural selection favored the gene. The example here would be sickle cell and the malaria gene, or the sickle cell gene and malaria. So sickle cell, having one copy of the sickle cell gene helps with malaria resistance. So natural selection favors the population to have a copy of the sickle cell gene so that they can be resistant to malaria. The next cause could be an example of gene flow, that the population has new immigrants that are coming in that are carrying this gene. So that could cause a change in the frequency of how much you see it in the population. So you see this microevolution. For example, a light-skinned population crosses with the dark-skinned population, and now you have hybrids. You've brought immigrants, bringing that in. Third cause is that a non-resistant version of the gene, sorry, we have some difficulties here of me not being able to spell, mutated into a resistant version of the gene. And so this may be something you see with like a natural immunity to a disease. And so you've started to see an increase in the frequency of the resistant version of the gene, but that was due to a mutation that brought a non-resistant gene to now resistant status. The last cause would be genetic drift from one generation to the next. And you could see that with the founder effect, where a small portion of the population goes and finds a new population, and so there may not be as much variety in that original starter population because it's such a small sample. So that would be an example of genetic drift, and that could change our frequency of the gene. So microevolution can be measured over very short periods of time, and we're focused more on the genes, these particular sequences of DNA. So 2 things that we need to really kind of hammer home with this microevolution here is that selection is going to act on the phenotype, because differential reproduction happens based on phenotype. One squirrel does not look at another squirrel and say, hey, I really like your big A, little a genotype here. They look at it and say, hey, you're really great at gathering acorns, and so I would like my offspring to be really good at that too, so let's mate. So selection acts upon the phenotype, not on the genotype, because your differential reproduction, your survivorship, depend upon phenotype, not genotype. Yes, genotype controls phenotype, but the animal is not looking at the particular DNA or the plant or whoever is reproducing at the time. Also, the other thing we need to keep in mind is that natural selection acts on individuals, but the whole population is what evolves. Okay? We may see an adaptation in a particular individual that is better than something else. And so that individual, natural selection is happening to. They're winning that natural selection race. But it's the population as a whole that will eventually shift over time. And you see these changes in the gene frequency, allele frequency, because of that natural selection, because of that favorable reproduction. So macroevolution is more of a large-scale evolution. This is on a scale of separated gene pools, not particular individuals, but entirely separate gene pools populations. And so you get accumulation of change in this gene pool that can eventually result in speciation. Remember, speciation is the formation of a new species, and a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed. Okay, so remember, they can interbreed, and when they interbreed, they can produce viable, so offspring that are going to live, they're going to survive, and they're going to be fertile. You're going to have offspring that are able to produce other offspring. For example, a mule. So a horse and a donkey can interbreed. It can produce a viable offspring, the mule, but that mule is sterile. So a horse and a donkey remain two separate species. So a species is able to interbreed, produce viable, fertile offspring. And so when we're looking at evolution on the macro side, this can actually lead to speciation, the formation of the new species. So with macroevolution, we are focused on the species level, not the gene level like we were with microevolution. And so the process of this speciation occurring may fall, depending upon the forces that are driving it. So speciation could be a macro or a microevolution situation depending upon what is driving that evolution to happen. So as we're talking about macroevolution, when we're talking about these changes on a large scale, and we've been talking about a gene pool here, we do need to make sure we understand what a gene pool is. The gene pool is all of the genes in a given species. Okay, so our sum total of all of the genes in a particular species, whether they're good, they're bad, they're beneficial, that's what we're talking about here. We're just looking about every single gene in that particular species. And so, again, the whole point of evolution is to keep your genes in that gene pool. You don't want them to fall out of that gene pool. So we're going to work some with mostly this vocabulary in class, and we'll keep going with our evolution stuff.